Mentioned I'm an affiliate, and I used to be the economics coordinator for the Center of Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events at USC. Our director is Detloff von Winterfeld, who's one of the founding directors, who was also president of EASA for a few years, early this decade. So this is an overview. I'm going to cover these 5 topics. And there's a lot to cover, so perhaps I can get some suggestions from you on which of these topics is most important to you. So I'm going to talk about the importance of benefit estimation of disaster risk management and a specific study from the US, co-benefits in general. Have you heard of the resilience triple dividend? Is that a familiar term to you now? That's what the sort of latest characterization is. Talk about a broad economic consequence analysis framework where we estimate the broad level of benefits, not necessarily co-benefits in a standard way, but some interesting other benefits. And then talk about a development of a decision support tool. This is a piece of software which rapidly estimates the economic consequences of a broad range of threats, and can be used to make major resource allocation decisions if you have to decide on spending money across them. So which have the highest consequences. It does not have a risk component, so it needs to be merged with some estimate of the likelihood of each of these events. And that's the 5 topics. Do you have a preference for me to emphasize any one of them more than others?
I have already sent the offer, which was
let's say the first, the third one, and the 4th one.
Or most interest you. Okay, well that's
Yeah,
fine.
included.
So I will do that. Anybody else? All right.
C'était le deuxième dans la liste.
So the background is, when we talk about co-benefits, we're talking about gains from disaster risk management investments other than those directly intended to lower the risk. So we lower the risk by a whole range of actions, such as building dams or seawalls, or structurally reinforcing buildings, or land use planning. But there are side effects or other intended effects that emanate from those. And so the main potential is a way of capturing all of the benefits and helping make the case, business case or public policy case, for investment in disaster risk management. It also shows that the benefits are more widely spread than we might first imagine. So most investments in disaster risk management are undervalued by both the private and public sector for a variety of reasons, which I'll touch on. And there's a need to incentivize businesses to take co-benefits into account, both pre and post-disaster, because there are many benefits that or losses to be avoided even after the disaster strikes, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And so how do we incentivize businesses? Well, this opens the role for the public sector to help close the gap between what's privately optimal to the individual business and what's in the best interests of society. So let me begin by talking about a study which I led that was completed in about 2005. So the U.S. Congress was concerned about how FEMA, this Federal Emergency Management Agency, was spending its money. They had something called a Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is primarily grants to individual state and local governments to help them in rebuilding after disasters. Over this 10-year period, they had spent about $6 billion on this, and we were asked to come up with do a benefit cost analysis of those grants. And the study is sometimes known as the 4-to-1 study, because this was the average benefit cost ratio. We found that the benefit cost ratio for earthquakes was only about 1.3, and that's because in the United States, and you've probably seen these trends in industrialized countries, the emphasis is more on life safety. So what we have is an increasing, if you look at the dichotomy between industrialized countries and developing countries, the trend in industrialized countries has been, yes, there are more frequent disasters, but the loss of life has gone down. Property damage keeps going up. In developing countries, both keep going up. So the emphasis in earthquake investments were mainly to save lives. Improving light fixtures in schools was one of the major things. On the other hand, for flood hazard mitigation, the benefit cost ratio was 5.0. And one of the reasons is that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. One popular mitigation policy in the U.S. is to buy out people from the floodplains. In other words, purchase their homes and their property and move them somewhere else. And the reason this has a high benefit cost ratio is you have to multiply the benefits by the probability of occurrence. And there are many places that have repetitive floods, and people are insistent upon rebuilding in the floodplain. This is their home, but it's a waste of money. And then in the U.S., I don't know if you have this in France, FEMA often bails people out. So if you have a bailout, you get funding, you don't have much incentive to take precautionary measures. So the average ratio was 4-to-1, and this was about 14 billion discounted present value savings, and it is equivalent to a 14% rate of return on a 50-year annuity. So this led to an increased congressional appropriation of $100 million in the year right after the disaster, right after the study. And it's still widely cited in congressional hearings every time one talks about funding for disaster risk management. And right now there's a second version called Mitigation Saves 2 that is underway. So this is actually it was mandated by Congress. FEMA spent the money, but it was an independent study, and it's mainly supervised by something called the National Institute of Building Sciences in the U.S. And this is a trade association comprised of architects and engineers in the U.S. It's a high-level trade association that is less interested in just promoting the industry, but also does a lot of research and public outreach. And so one of the main difference, well, there are two main differences in Mitigation 2 study, which should be out within a year. And the Mitigation 1 study was primarily public sector mitigation projects, rebuilding and reinforcing city halls, or bridges and roads, firehouses, for example. But more than 90% of the assets in the U.S. are owned by the private sector, so this one will focus on the private sector, and we'll do more on the co-benefit side than we did originally. So we expect the benefit cost ratio to potentially be higher than 4-to-1. Any questions on this? I don't know if I sent you the paper, but so if you just Google mitigation saves, you'll see the whole study. There's a paper I have a Natural Hazards Review.
This is a paper.
Right, that's the condensed version. It has about 14 authors. If you know the name Kathleen Tierney, very prominent in the U.S.
One of the co-authors?
Yeah, is one. She was. Do you know the Natural Hazards Center?
Kathleen Tierney.
Right. If you know the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado, it's a major clearinghouse for data.
Yes.
Has an annual workshop that encourages people from all over the world to come. So Kathleen just stepped down after maybe about 12 years as the director of that. So any questions on the first? But the bottom line here is that doing a thorough study to have some good solid numbers that are credible goes a long way in drawing attention to the benefits of disaster risk management and gaining support from the public and private sector. And so this has been very valuable. And when essentially, as I said, there were about 3,000 of these hazard mitigation grants over the course of 10 years. We redid the benefit cost analysis for only about 250 of a random sample. And it took a team a year and a half to do, but it's not like you have to go back and evaluate every possible grant. A good random sample will do it to have a credible study.
But this means that there is no ex-ante cost-benefit analysis to attribute a grant.
Oh, well, here's essentially what happened. Every grant applicant had to do a benefit cost analysis, right? But there are two problems. One is that the approaches they used were not standard. People used sort of different. And there's also a bias and incentive to inflate your numbers to get the money. So we couldn't just look at their benefit cost analysis and say these are correct. And then we had to independently do them. And we never got down to comparing our numbers with theirs. We didn't want to. But we had a solid methodology. Are you familiar with HAZUS?
Yes.
This is, okay, so some of you are. This is called Hazards US, and it's a software tool developed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency 20 years ago to do primarily economic consequence analysis, emphasis on property damage, lives lost, and business interruption. It's called damage, death, and downtime is the colloquial term, and that helped immensely. Many other countries are developing a tool like this. The Australians are. Some of you from geology and geography. Our next IDRIN conference is in Sydney next year, and it will be essentially hosted by CSRIO, which I'm sure I've heard of. CSRIO, which is the Commonwealth, but essentially it's a combination of U.S. Geological Survey and some sort of broader organizations. I'm trying to think, but mainly sort of like the USGS and some arms of FEMA. So this is just to start out with the topic number one. So when we talk about co-benefits of disaster risk management, there are four categories. So there's benefits to the business undertaking the action. The third sub-bullet, improved ability to deal with multiple threats, is the main reason a business does this, in order to prevent damage and business interruption. But it also can improve the image of a business and improve the credit rating of a business, or lower its insurance costs, for example. So all of those are direct considerations. Many people, when they estimate these, find it's hard to quantify the improved business image, but implicitly businesses make such a calculation in their decision. There's also benefits to other businesses through supply chain effects. So there's a classic example of San Francisco Airport, for instance. One of the ways you can reduce your risk in the U.S. is you can pay a reliability premium on your electricity, which means if there's a shortage of electricity, you are a preferred customer, so you pay a little extra each month on your electricity bill for this. So the San Francisco Airport bought this interruptibility insurance, but its main supplier of jet fuel did not. And so it wouldn't do any good to have electricity to operate the airport if you couldn't have jet fuel. So there are that kind of connection, and obviously when we talk about business interruption, there is a situation if you cannot produce, your customers who need critical inputs cannot produce. You also cancel your orders upstream in the supply chain as well. So you have these interdependency effects. Another one is a contagion effect, for instance, which is especially major consideration in urban areas where you're in a lack of diligence and disaster risk management puts at risk your neighbors from your building catching on fire in theirs, or your building collapsing and falling on theirs too. So investments have this first set of kinds of market interdependent spillover effects and then physical spillover effects. So then there's some benefits to the general business environment, which is broader, that typically most of these are not captured by the individual business. And this is reduced uncertainty in general, increased economic stability, and both of these help the investment environment, make investment more attractive for everyone in the economy. Often disaster risk management involves some technological progress, and all of this contributes to enhanced economic growth in a community that undertakes this. Some of the broader benefits to society: you have improved health and education, improved environmental quality because you have less toxic material that is spilled into the atmosphere as a result of disasters, and many disaster preparedness activities actually help in terms of occupational health and safety as well. So these are 4 broad categories of disaster, co-benefits of disaster risk management. And one of the key things that I didn't mention at the outset that's very important is that they are more tangible and immediate, these last 3 categories. They're always more immediate, and some of them are more tangible, than in the loss avoidance that you intend to reduce. And what I mean is that if you structurally reinforce a building, it may cost you $10 million, and if the earthquake never strikes or the flood never comes, it looks like you wasted your money on the surface to the uneducated person. And so this makes it risky for politicians too. They don't want to look bad in this. So in other words, you don't really see the benefits of your activity until the disaster strikes and your building is protected from the flood and your neighbor's isn't, and you can say, oh yes, you see the benefits of what we've reaped. But again, that may never happen. On the other hand, things like the improved business image happens quickly, the reduction of uncertainty, improved business climate does, and some of the other co-benefits that I mentioned take place. It's also consistent with what we call a no regrets strategy. Do you know what we mean by it? Okay. So it's basically, even if the disaster doesn't strike, you still get some benefits. It's just like energy efficiency in the climate change area, that energy efficiency saves you money, so even if warming never takes place, you can't regret what you did because you've saved some money in the meantime. So it lends itself, I don't have to go through every one of these, but one of the things is that it spreads to more stakeholders, so many more people benefit from private sector investment in disaster risk management than would be immediately obvious to the business. And one can say all of society benefits just a little bit, typically. And this should be taken into account. And economists often make this distinction between what's in the best interests of a business and what's in the best interests of society. And those aren't always the same. So there are many reasons for the shortfalls in private sector investment in disaster risk management. And these are some economic jargon, externalities, unintended side effects, ripple effects that we want to avoid. The reason for mentioning this is that it's like going to the doctor it helps the doctor to know what's causing your pain or affliction before the doctor prescribes the medicine. So we didn't say we want to jump in and improve the situation, but it helps to know whether the investment is due to public good effects, which is a situation where you can't really, you produce something but you can't exclude other people from benefiting from it. So you may initiate some flood control for your community or your business, and that flood control also benefits others, and they don't have to pay for it. You know, it's public good doesn't mean good so much in terms of this is positive or good. Public good in this case means a good that can be shared by many, but you can't exclude anybody. And if you can't exclude anybody, you can't extract a price for it, and it's not going to be profitable for at least the other people that benefit. So again, when we start getting at solutions, we often go back to the causes and match the cause, just like your doctor matches the medicine to not just the symptoms, but the underlying. So there, in addition to there being reasons why private sector investment in disaster risk management falls short, there's also shortfall in the public sector in something called political failure. And so we often talk about market failure. And sometimes the assumption is, well, if the government steps in, everything will be fine. But there are problems with government action too. Many officials are not responsive to the needs of their constituents. They're more interested in staying in office or catering to a narrow band of them. They have many things to do and don't always make sound decisions. So there is this political failure. There's also a moral hazard situation. It's, you know, if you're an agency in charge of responding to disasters and people are needy and they are incur losses and displaced and afflicted, there's this tendency to want to help them, but if you keep bailing them out, it undercuts the incentive for them to take precautionary measures. And so, you know, this group should be well aware of this. For instance, FEMA just asked me to head up a study we finished about a year ago on initiating a deductible to their post-disaster public assistance, where they typically paid 3/4 of the losses. This would have a deductible based on risk and physical capacity of the entities, and to make it even more attractive. There's a credit system, so if you had a $10 million deductible, if you made investments of $5 million, that would bring down your deductible. So this is a lot like the deductible you have on your automobile insurance. It makes you be a little more careful, and this is considered innovative because I don't know what the situation is in France, but you know, there's a concern that disaster losses are going up, and so the burden on the Treasury will go up. On the other hand, we still live in an era of tight budgets, so this is one of the ways of helping society by reducing losses and helping the government. Yes.
I have a very specific question about the reduction of uncertainty. I'm just coming from foreign countries in Africa, and I was disappointed that measurements related to water and floods are missing completely. And we are trying to convince local governments to start again with that kind of approach to reduce uncertainty on risk, floods, drought periods also too. And have you carried out any study in terms of benefits? Because it appears that this kind of approach costs a lot of money, you have to hire a new civil servant who after sometimes will do more or less nothing. I was in a station in North Ghana. There were 5 people to survey 1 rainfall meter. And I'm not sure the rainfall was measured properly. And reduce uncertainty is really for us a big question in terms of weather management and risk management linked with floods.
Well, there are a number of models available in industrialized countries, and I'm sure you have some as well that are hydrological model. In the U.S. we have something called EPINET. It's Environmental Protection Agency, has flood mapping, hydrology linked to flood vulnerability, software that's very, very good. And rather than reinventing the wheel, meaning starting from scratch, one can use the structure of a modeling approach from another country and fill it in with your own local data and be in very good shape to at least give approximate values for your flood vulnerability. So I think there's the potential, and if you write to me, I can refer you to some of this software. And I also know some, you know the name ImageCat at all? Have you heard of that? It's a firm based in Long Beach, and they do remote sensing, satellite imagery, loss estimation based on geotechnical and hydrological considerations, and they produce various products and software on an as-needed basis all over the world to help, you know, and again, they are well positioned and knowledgeable such that the cost has been lowered by their expertise to be able to adapt what they have to a given location, to a country.
Maybe one comment, to reduce the data acquisition cost, we have to take benefits from the new technologies coming from remote sensing data. We were talking about that, but there are now a certain number of satellites based on Sentinel technologies, and the European community is producing want to produce new services to get important field data and to constrain the models. So probably we have also to explore this opportunity, because it's free data. You can we are just as a scientist to make the service, to invent the service, and to put the service at disposal to the
Well, like I said, I can put you in touch with this company that has had, you know, almost 20 years of experience in doing this and works for governments all over the world in the private sector, and can show you examples of how data like this have been used effectively in modeling, software, decision-making, etc. So, as I said, I probably...
Sorry, but thank you for your point, and just open question. I'm wondering if you know some mechanism to foster resilience based on taxation. Yes, just reduce taxation.
Reducing taxation.
There is
Okay.
very interesting example in France with it mainly based on how to deal with major, it's more industrial risk, and tools for land use planning called technological risk prevention plan. And at the end, you have constraint within your organization, but also constraint on buildings. And at the end of the year, you have the possibility in your tax declaration to have a kind of, to declare that you have invested.
Invested, right.
Yeah.
Right.
A rebate on the tax.
Right. So that's a type of rebate or tax credit, which can be very effective. One can say it's a subsidy offsetting a tax, but it's an incentive. Yes, I could see that being very worthwhile and probably pretty effective. The businesses typically respond to something like that. So it's similar, in terms of general principle to what we see in other cases. We talked about the fire insurance case, the FEMA example that I mentioned.
And two other points, and wondering, would like to have your comment on that. A lot of people here, but more based on risk approach, use the terms cost-benefit approach.
Right.
And you're focusing on another way of dealing with that and focusing on benefit cost. Is there a meaning for that?
Oh, well, I'm not a purist, and I know there are people who work on benefit cost analysis. Either the purists worked on it, that's their main area, or sometimes politicians fight about it. But the preferred term now is benefit cost analysis, really to put the benefit up front. I mean, it's almost a matter of public relations and semantics. Benefit comes first, like movie stars who always argue about who gets first billing. It gets your attention first. The benefit cost analysis is thought to put the emphasis on the benefits first off, but it's really the same methodology.
Yeah, but in fact, it seems to be the same methodology, but the idea is very interesting. These last years, there was a reform of impact studies in France, noticing also that we were over-focusing on bad outcomes, just after an event or on a project, and the need to also focus on good outcomes.
Opportunities.
And opportunities.
Opportunities, right.
So it changed the philosophy and how you deal with things. So it's very interesting.
Right. Without getting into it, to me, if you really think about it, the benefit side of a benefit cost analysis, what you essentially have to do is estimate the losses, and the benefits are the avoided losses. And so you still have to do that, and ironically, it's the large loss cases that give you the greater benefits. So, perhaps some of that is due to misunderstanding of what a benefit is and what a cost is too.
Absolutely.
That's the irony. So let me go on to some areas perhaps a little less familiar with. Economic consequence analysis is the modern term for what used to be called hazard loss estimation. And at the center for which I'm affiliated, CREATE, there is we've worked the last 10 years to generate a very broad framework that includes those considerations that are listed there, and I'll show you a diagram in a minute. What led me to this was a study I did about 9 years ago, on the economic consequences of bioterrorism attacks, and you see on the far right, the numbers seem to be very similar except for a water service disruption. We also did a bioterrorist attack on the lettuce crop, and because there's so many substitutes for lettuce, it was pretty trivial in terms of hardly any loss. But you see they're similar in terms of total gross output, but what we have emphasized is, in addition to ordinary business interruption losses, lost revenues from sales lost profits, that there are behavioral effects from some of these attacks that have high visibility and instill fear in people that can be quite large. So the airport attack relates to the fact that the largest single effect on business interruption after the World Trade Center attacks was the almost 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism. And so that's a behavioral effect that was off-site. It had nothing to do with the trade centers falling themselves or the business operating there. It was all over the country, all over the world. And then we also have resilience, which refers, and I'll give you a better definition, things that mute the impacts by offsetting of effects or special measures that we take. So yes, airline travel went down, but people didn't just stay home. They took the bus or railway. There's still a loss because foreign tourists can't take the bus to get to the U.S. um, unless they come from Canada or Mexico, so you still have a loss. And so what you see is that the behavioral linkages are very prominent, the resilience is very prominent, and these have to be measured in order to come up with a precise estimate. So our framework is here, and in the old days you had, you have the event and hazard loss estimation. There's loss of life and target specific impacts, often just property damage considered, and the sometimes there's indirect impacts that were calculated and you get a total impact. Well, we added these resilience adjustments, we added behavioral linkages, we took into account direct remediation costs, cleanup, and restoration, which for things like biological, chemical, nuclear, and radiological can be very expensive, into account. Benefit cost analysis automatically puts these on the cost side. This approach is more agnostic because some of these activities can actually stimulate the economy, and so the model has a way of determining what that outcome is going to be in terms of the influence of this effect, positive or negative. Then we also have more recently translated this into a benefit cost analysis capability by including mitigation or disaster risk reduction aspects up front, and the spillover effects like the examples I mentioned, and again, all of these have indirect effects. So this is our framework that we implement in various analyses when we do case studies or in our software tool that I'll be showing you. So let me talk about economic resilience. So this will be something new to some of you. So in the United States, there's kind of a debate about what resilience is. So to some people, especially engineers, resilience is anything you do to reduce risk. Upfront mitigation or things you do after the disaster. So to me and most social scientists, there's always been a perfectly good word for what you do before, and that's mitigation. What we've needed is an umbrella term for what we can do afterwards. And so I prefer to use resilience in that second way, to actions you can take afterwards. And I guess maybe jumping ahead in the next slide. So some people say, well, what can you do after the disaster? You know, the building has been destroyed. Well, property damage is only one measure of the costs of disasters. The other is, and that's what we call a stock measure, it happens at a point in time. But we need to also focus on the flow of goods and services from this capital stock. That's what gives people well-being. It's not the building itself, but the fact that it provides shelter or a place to do business. And these are typically measured in terms of gross domestic product or employment, and they're often referred to as business interruption. And the point is that business interruption just begins, you know, when the disaster strikes, but continues until you've recovered. So you have many opportunities after the disaster strikes to reduce this business interruption. So you might think, well, how serious has been your business interruption? Well, very serious. For instance, the World Trade Center value, the property damage was $25 billion. The estimate of the business interruption was $110 billion. So if we bring this into 2017 dollars, it's more like 35 billion to 140 billion, 4 times the size. The business interruption, 4 times the size. Hurricane Katrina, the property damage was 75 billion. The business interruption is well over 100 billion, and it may not even be over because many people think New Orleans really hasn't recovered. You know, it depends on what your definition of recovery is. So this business interruption is very important, and we prefer to, at least I prefer to think of resilience as tactics that you implement to reduce this business interruption. And it's more complicated than property damage, which is mainly an engineering concept because it involves behavioral considerations and policy considerations. So I've studied resilience across 10 disciplines: organizational behavior, political science, sociology, ecology, planning, economics. I've found more commonalities than differences. And so what I've got here in the definition, I've got a general definition that attempts to capture the essence of the definition, and then the economic counterpart. So the essence of the general definition of static resilience, point in time, ability of a system to maintain function when it's shocked by some external force. So this is the Holling, consistent with the Holling definition, Buzz Holling, C.S. Holling, an ecologist who's probably the most cited person in this. And so to an economist, the counterpart is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. This is the counterpart. And so what the economic definition adds is the word efficient, because you don't want to just casually respond. You want to do so in the least cost manner. It also gets to the heart, all of this gets to the heart of the concept of economics. The root justification for economics is the fact that we live in a world of scarcity. If we lived in a world of plenty, we wouldn't have to economize. We would just pick the apples off the tree, but we have to make wise choices. So we live in this world of scarcity, and we use efficient use of resources. So some examples are things like, if we have a lack of some critical materials, like water, we might conserve on them. We might recycle the water when we didn't think we could do that under normal circumstances. People haven't done. We might substitute some other input, trucked or bottled water. We might have water storage available to us in advance that we can tap. We also have something we call production recapture or rescheduling, which, let's say when the water surface is available and the factory is intact, you just run your production process overtime and extra shifts and wind up reducing. So the resilience is not passively reacting to the disaster, but taking active measures to reduce losses. And these can be very, very effective and should be part of disaster risk management. Not everything should be all about land use planning before or structural reinforcement. It should be, and there are things that can be done afterwards and incentives that can be created. So dynamic economic resilience, the general definition here is the PIM, P-I-M-M, definition of resilience, the ability and speed of a system to recover. And the economic counterpart is the efficient use of resources over time for investment in repair and reconstruction, including expediting the process and adapting to change. Just one more thing, the reason this is dynamic from an economic standpoint is the time dimension, and investment to an economist is a process where you set aside things you could consume today to build assets that yield productive services over their useful life over time. That's the dynamic. Yes?
Yeah, just one question. In terms of social impact, after a disaster, for example, after a terrorist attack, are you considering the social impact and its evaluation part, or are you integrating that in the economic aspect?
Okay. All right. Well, I have to say, my own work, primarily we focus on the economics, but for instance, mitigation saves too, and there is an overlap. All right, so mitigation saves too, we're looking at population displacement and the cost of that population displacement in terms of increased cost. We are not looking at post-traumatic syndrome, you know, I might say, however. But these can be quantified, and I think it's a good idea to do it and factor those in, and reducing those kinds of things represent yet another co-benefit. But they're not something included in here. Just realize the time. So we have a loss metric, resilience metric. It's the avoided losses divided by the maximum potential losses in this slide. basically says we were able to measure this for the World Trade Center attack and found that the rapid relocation of businesses helped prevent 72% of the potential losses. You know, one of the reasons why the airline travel was the major effect was because the more ordinary losses were muted by resilience. And we've done studies of ports, which shows an example of a simulated study that through things like rerouting ships and export diversion to replace imports and a few other techniques, you can reduce resilience by, reduce losses by 67%. There are behavioral linkages that I mentioned before, off-site responses with behavioral effects, and these often are generated by fear, and it can exacerbate the losses by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, and especially for terrorism become very important. There are some examples. So we developed a tool called ECAT, Economic Consequence Analysis Tool, software, and I would just, in the 2 minutes remaining, show you the user interface. And we have developed this for 9 threats so far. So all the user has to do is click on one of these, nuclear attack, maritime cyber disruption, decide what kind of uncertainty display you want, and then hit go, and it gives you, the next screen pops up. This is an example for an earthquake, and gives you an estimate that if you have a 7.8 magnitude earthquake in the U.S. under certain sort of conditions in terms of what time of day that it will hit and the economic structure of the economy affected, could generate $120 billion worth of damage. And there are various default considerations. The gray area means the location is not so key in this, which gives ballpark estimates that somehow what taken account of in the economic structure and the time of day. And behavioral effects are not so prominent as in a nuclear attack or attack on an airport. But resilience options are there, the ability to relocate people. There's a drop-down list which defines what we mean by relocation. The default options are no resilience, and then if you hit on these, they'll give you low, medium, or high levels of ability to relocate economic activity, low and high levels of production recapture. And if we basically put single parameter. This is an example of not hitting the resilience options, but changing from a 7.9 magnitude earthquake to a 6. And so, you know, remember the Richter scale is logarithmic, so this is almost, the 7.9 is almost 100 times as strong as the 6, and so the losses are much lower. If we hit the next slide,
Is this an open source software?
Yes. So if you hit the Create website, if you want to learn more about the development, buy my book. So it's called the Economic Consequence Analysis Tool book, and it's the second book in the iDream series, but the software is available. And again, it gives you ballpark estimates, but is, and you know, more oriented toward the U.S., but I would encourage people to consider doing this. Now, it is not an easy thing to develop in that we have this complexity model of thousands of equations, and we run simulations and translate them into a regression equation that we can put in the software. And, you know, but we can share the method in the book, and that will save a great deal of cost, but there's still an effort to develop the modules, and like I say, we still have the ambition of developing another 20. So, conclusion, you know, I think you understand the importance co-benefits can make. They can double, triple the case in terms of the benefit side. The benefits can be identified. There are still other benefits to be brought into account. There he's helped in terms of private sector own decision-making as well as incentivization with the cooperation or the involvement of government, and we have developed these major tools for economic consequence analysis which can help make these resource allocation decisions. And the last slide is just, there's the name of the book and various papers we've published over the years in journals like Natural Hazards Review and Risk Analysis and International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. There's a paper I wrote with Elizabeth Krausman at the Joint Research Center in ISPRA, and what we did was lay the groundwork for developing a business resilience index, making the case that vulnerability indices, many people have made the mistake, think resilience is just the flip side of vulnerability, but vulnerability is contextual. It's background conditions, the literacy rate, the income rate. Resilience is about action. It's things you do to recover, and you can't change the literacy rate overnight or the percent minority. It's actions like the ones I've described that businesses and communities can undertake to get on their feet. Oh, that's a good alarm.